Kale's heart pounded in his chest as the walls of his dream began to close in around him. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as shadows stretched longer and deeper, encircling him like a web. His breaths came in shallow gasps, the only sound the frantic rhythm of his heartbeat in the silence. And then, as if emerging from the very fabric of the darkness itself, the figure appeared. "You cannot escape me," it whispered, the voice chilling and echoing in his ears. Kale tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive shadows. His legs moved, but they felt heavy, as if he was wading through thick mud. The figure stepped closer, its eyes glowing an unnatural red, burning into him. He stumbled backward, but it was no use. Every step he took only brought him closer to the figure. Kale's pulse raced as he felt the nightmare closing in on him, his mind struggling to make sense of the surreal terror. Suddenly, he jolted awake, gasping for breath, drenched in sweat. The harsh reality of his bedroom, bathed in moonlight, felt both comforting and unsettling. The walls were familiar, but his racing heart reminded him that something was terribly wrong. Kale sat up, trying to calm his breathing. He looked around the room, but there was no figure, no dark shadows, just the cold silence of the night. But the feeling lingered, like the remnants of a bad dream that refused to fade. He reached for the medallion on his bedside table, the one he had found in the forest weeks ago. It was faintly glowing, its surface warm to the touch, as though alive with an energy Kale couldn't understand. The moment his fingers wrapped around it, a strange vision flickered through his mind, a dark silhouette, a whisper of the same voice that had haunted his dream. The Dream Binder, Kale whispered to himself, the name coming to him almost instinctively. The nightmares have been getting worse ever since he found the medallion. But it wasn't just the nightmares. It was the dreams, the voices, the sense that something was pulling him deeper into a world he could not escape. The next morning, Kale ventured into the village, though he barely recognized the streets anymore. The eternal night had cast its long shadow over everything, and the world seemed devoid of warmth. The sun had not risen in years. People moved like ghosts, their faces tired, their eyes hollow. No one dared to look up at the sky, and no one seemed to remember what daylight felt like. As Kale walked, his mind raced. Who was the Dreambinder? What did he want from him? The medallion was more than just an artifact. It was a key, a symbol of something far greater and far darker than he could comprehend. Lost in thought, Kale almost didn't notice the girl standing near the crumbling lamppost. She was tall, with sharp features and an air of confidence that immediately drew his attention. "You're Kale, aren't you?" she said, her voice calm but sure. Kale froze. "How do you know my name?" She smirked, almost as if she'd been waiting for him. "I know a lot of things, like the fact that you've been having dreams. Terrifying ones, I assume." Kale's heart skipped a beat. How could she know? "What are you talking about?" "You're not the only one," the girl said, stepping closer. "There are others, people like you, who are dreaming the same dreams. The Dreambinder is coming. And it's not just in your head, it's real." Before Kale could respond, a large hand landed on his shoulder. He turned to see Ronan, a man whose silent presence was almost as intimidating as his appearance. With a scar running down the side of his face, Ronan exuded an aura of danger and strength. Ronan's eyes narrowed. "She's right. We've all been touched by the Dreambinder, and we need to stop him before he traps us all." Kale looked between the two of them, his mind spinning. "What do you mean, trap us all?" "Follow me," Ronan said, turning without another word. Kale had no choice but to follow, and the girl, Lyra, joined them without hesitation. They led him to a small, dimly lit room at the edge of the village. Inside, a woman stood by a dusty table covered in ancient scrolls and strange symbols. Her eyes glowed faintly with an otherworldly light, and her presence seemed to command the room. "This is Ira," Lyra introduced her. "She knows more about the Dreambinder than anyone." Ira studied Kale with a penetrating gaze, as if she could see into the depths of his soul. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "The Dreambinder is not just a nightmare. He is an ancient being, a creature who exists between the realms of dreams and reality. And he's growing stronger. Soon, He will have the power to trap us all in a never-ending nightmare. Kale's mind reeled. What can we do? Ira took a deep breath. There's a way to stop him, but it requires all of us. We must confront him in the realm of dreams and find the key to his power. The medallion you hold. It's a part of that key. Kale looked down at the medallion in his hand, the glow now brighter than before. He didn't fully understand, but he felt a surge of energy in it, a sense that it was leading him towards something he had to do. Ira's voice broke through his thoughts. The Dreambinder is coming for you, Kale. And when he finds you, he won't let go. Kale nodded, determination filling him. He couldn't run from this. He had to face the darkness before it consumed him. The room felt colder now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on Kale. The strange symbols on the walls of Ira's chamber glowed faintly, casting eerie shadows across the room. Kale stood frozen, the medallion in his hand pulsing with a strange energy. Every word Ira spoke echoed in his mind, reminding him of the terrifying force they were up against. The Dreambinder isn't just in your dreams, Kale, Ira said, her voice low and steady. He's in the real world too, and soon, he'll be strong enough to bring his nightmare into our reality. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. Kale looked down at the medallion, the light from it flickering like a heartbeat. He had thought the medallion was simply a strange object, but now he understood that it was something far more important. What do we do now? Kale asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ira looked at him with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see straight through him. You must enter the realm of dreams, Kale. You have the key, the medallion, but it won't be easy. The Dreambinder is powerful, and he's already searching for you. A chill ran down Kale's spine at the thought. The realm of dreams was a place where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred. It was a place where even the bravest souls feared to tread. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes bright with determination. We're not letting you go alone, Kale. We're in this together. All of us. Ronan nodded silently, his expression unreadable but firm. He was a man of few words, but his presence spoke volumes. Kale glanced between the three of them. So, what do we do next? Ira motioned toward the table covered in scrolls and symbols. We need to prepare. The Dreambinder's power grows stronger every day. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to stop him. She pulled one of the scrolls from the table and unrolled it. The parchment was old, its edges frayed, but the symbols written on it were sharp and clear. Ira's finger traced over the ancient markings. This is the ritual we must perform. It will open the path to the dream realm. Kale's heart raced as he watched her. The ritual sounded complicated, dangerous even, but it was their only hope. The medallion in his hand seemed to hum, as if it recognized the importance of the task ahead. We must gather certain items, Ira continued. A piece of silver moonstone, a vial of water from the Midnight River, and a feather from the dream bird. Only then can we enter the dream realm safely. Kale nodded, his mind already racing with the tasks ahead. The Midnight River, the dream bird. He had heard of these things in old legends, but he had never imagined they were real. Where do we find these things? Kale asked. Lyra smiled, her confidence unwavering. The silver moonstone is in the hollow cavern, guarded by creatures of the deep. The Midnight River is located at the edge of the dark forest, and the dream bird, well, that one's a little trickier. Kale's eyes widened. Creatures of the deep? Dark forest? Dreambird? Don't worry, Lyra said with a wink. We've faced worse. Ronan stepped forward, his voice low and calm. We leave at dawn. The longer we wait, the more powerful the Dreambinder becomes. He's already hunting us. Kale swallowed hard, nodding in agreement. The reality of what lay ahead began to sink in. They were about to embark on a journey into the unknown, to face dangers they couldn't even imagine. That night, as Kale lay in bed, he found it hard to sleep. His mind raced with thoughts of the Dreambinder and the dark forces they were about to face. He clutched the medallion tightly, as if its glow could somehow offer him comfort. He thought of the others. Lyra, with her confident smile and fearless nature. Ronan, the silent warrior who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. And Ira, the healer whose knowledge of the dream realm was their only chance at survival. Kale knew that they were all in this together, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the true danger lay ahead in the realm of dreams. The Dreambinder was a being of immense power, and if they weren't careful, they could easily fall into his trap. The night stretched on, and Kale drifted in and out of restless sleep. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the figure again, the shadowy figure that had haunted his dreams. But this time, it wasn't a dream. It was a vision of the Dreambinder, standing before him, its glowing eyes burning with hatred. "You cannot escape me," the voice whispered again, its chilling tone echoing in Kale's mind. Suddenly, Kale was awake, his body covered in a cold sweat. The vision felt too real. He couldn't escape the feeling that the Dreambinder was closer than ever before. The next morning, the group gathered in Ira's chamber, ready to begin their journey. Kale's heart was heavy with uncertainty, but he knew that there was no turning back. The fate of their world depended on what they did next. Ira handed Kale a small vial, the glass cool and smooth in his hand. "This will help you in the dream realm," she explained. "It's a potion that will allow you to retain some sense of reality. Without it, you might get lost in the darkness." Kale took the vial, nodding silently. Ronan's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the group. "Time's running out. We move now." And so, with a final glance at Ira's chamber, Kale, Lyra, and Ronan set out on their dangerous journey. The world outside was still shrouded in darkness, but there was no time to waste. The Dreambinder was waiting. The sun had barely risen when Kale, Lyra, and Ronan set off toward their first destination, the Hollow Cavern. The journey ahead felt like a dream in itself, surreal and terrifying. The path was winding, and the air was thick with an unsettling silence. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something dark to unfold. Kale's thoughts were consumed by the Dreambinder. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that shadowy figure, those glowing eyes staring right through him. The fear of the unknown gripped him, but he knew he couldn't let it control him. They had come too far, and there was no turning back now. "Stay alert," Ronan's voice cut through the silence, his eyes scanning the surroundings as if the trees themselves could be hiding threats. Lyra, ever the optimist, grinned. "Don't worry, Ronan. We got this." Kale nodded, though his heart wasn't as steady. He hadn't told the others about the dream he had last night, the vision of the Dreambinder. He wasn't sure if it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but it felt too real, too dangerous. The Hollow Cavern wasn't far from Ira's village, but it took longer than they had expected. The forest seemed endless, as though it was deliberately trying to keep them from their goal. The trees grew taller as they ventured deeper, their branches intertwining above them, blocking out most of the sunlight. When they finally reached the entrance of the cavern, Kale couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The entrance was dark, a yawning mouth of stone that seemed to swallow the light. The air was thick and musty, carrying the scent of damp earth and decay. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Kale asked, his voice uncertain. Lyra gave him an encouraging smile. "This is it, Kale. The Silver Moonstone is inside. We just have to be careful. There are creatures that guard it." Ronan gave her a sharp look. "Careful doesn't mean reckless. We move in quietly." The group entered the cavern, their footsteps echoing off the cold stone walls. As they ventured deeper, the darkness grew more oppressive, almost suffocating. Kale could feel his heart pounding in his chest. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the cavern, sending a chill down Kale's spine. He stopped in his tracks, every muscle tensed. The growl was followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the darkness. "Stay close," Ronan whispered, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. Lyra reached into her bag and pulled out a small crystal. She whispered something under her breath, and the crystal glowed with a soft, blue light. It illuminated the path ahead, revealing the creatures that had been hiding in the shadows. They were unlike anything Kale had ever seen. Large, with sharp, jagged teeth, and eyes that glowed an eerie yellow. Their bodies were covered in scales, and they moved with a fluid grace that was terrifying. Kale's breath caught in his throat. "What are they?" "Night Fangs," Lyra said, her voice steady despite the danger. "They've guarded the Silver Moonstone for centuries. If we can get past them, we'll be one step closer." The Night Fangs snarled, their eyes locked on the group. There were 3 of them, each more menacing than the last. "Get ready," Ronan said, his voice low. "We take them down quietly. No fighting unless we have to." The first Nightfang lunged at them, its mouth open wide, but Ronan was faster. With a swift motion, he drew his sword and slashed at the creature, narrowly avoiding its snapping teeth. The Nightfang recoiled, its glowing eyes filled with fury. Kale's heart raced as the second Nightfang moved toward him. He gripped his sword tightly, trying to steady his shaking hands. His mind raced. He had never fought a creature like this before, but the urgency of their mission pushed him forward. The Nightfang leaped at him, and Kale swung his sword in defense. The creature dodged his strike, but Kale was quick, thrusting his sword forward and catching it in the side. The Nightfang let out a shriek of pain and staggered back. Lyra, with her crystal glowing brightly, took advantage of the distraction. She held her hand out, and a burst of energy shot from her fingers, striking the second Nightfang. It howled in pain, falling to the ground with a heavy thud. Ronan didn't hesitate. He lunged at the third Nightfang, his sword cutting through the air. The creature was fast, but Ronan's precision was unmatched. With one swift strike, the Nightfang collapsed, its body going limp. For a moment, everything was still. Kale exhaled in relief, his heart still pounding in his chest. He had never been in a fight like that before, and the fear still gripped him. "That was too close," Kale muttered, wiping the sweat from his brow. Lyra nodded. "But we're safe for now. The Silver Moonstone should be just ahead." The group continued deeper into the cavern, their path illuminated by the faint glow of Lyra's crystal. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the center of the cavern. In the middle of a large, open space sat the Silver Moonstone. It was beautiful, glowing softly in the dim light, its surface shimmering like liquid silver. Kale approached it slowly, as though fearing it might vanish the moment he touched it. The Moonstone was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its energy radiated with a powerful force, both calming and unnerving at the same time. "This is it," Kale said quietly, reaching out to take it. But as soon as his fingers brushed the surface of the Moonstone, a loud, echoing growl reverberated through the cavern. Something was coming. "Get back!" Ronan shouted, pulling Kale away from the stone just in time. From the shadows emerged a figure, tall and menacing, its eyes glowing with a sinister red light. It was a creature unlike any they had seen before. Its body was covered in dark, jagged armor, and its wings were large enough to block out the light. "The Dreambinder's servant," Lyra whispered, her face pale with fear. "We have to fight our way out." Kale gripped his sword, his hands trembling. They had come so close. Would they survive the next challenge? The real fight had just begun. The air in the cavern grew heavy with tension. The Dreambinder's servant stood before them, its dark eyes fixed on Kale, the Silver Moonstone held tightly in his hand. There was an oppressive silence, as if time itself had stopped. Kale's pulse raced, and his sword trembled in his grip. The creature before them wasn't just a simple guardian. It exuded an unnatural power. He could feel its presence crawling under his skin, a deep, menacing force that made his senses scream for retreat. "Stay calm," Ronan hissed, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "We'll fight through this." Lyra stepped closer, her crystal still glowing, but her eyes showed fear. "If we fight, it will only weaken us. There has to be another way." Kale's mind raced. He glanced at the Silver Moonstone still in his hand. He didn't understand why it felt so important, why everything felt tied to it. But he knew one thing. The Dreambinder's servant wanted it, wanted him to have it. The creature took a step forward, its heavy boots clanking on the stone floor. Its voice echoed like the deep toll of a bell. "You cannot escape this place, little mortals," it growled, its voice dripping with malice. "The Moonstone belongs to the Dreambinder. Surrender it, and you will leave in peace." Kale tightened his grip on the sword. "We didn't come this far to give up. The Dreambinder will not control us." The creature let out a low, menacing laugh. "Foolish mortals, you think you could defy the Dreambinder? He holds the power to reshape reality itself. Surrender the stone, and I may spare your lives." Ronan stepped in front of Kale. "We've seen enough of your tricks. We're not leaving empty-handed." The cavern echoed with silence again. For a moment, it seemed as if time itself hung in suspension. Then, with a sudden burst of movement, the Dreambinder's servant lunged at Kale, its dark blade gleaming in the dim light. Kale barely managed to dodge, the creature's blade missing him by inches. Sparks flew as Ronan and Lyra joined the fight, their swords clashing with the servant's armor. The cavern filled with the clash of steel and the growling of beasts. Kale kept his focus on the silver moonstone. He had no intention of losing it. But as the fight continued, a strange feeling crept over him. The sensation of being trapped within a dream. The strikes from the servant slowed, as if time itself was distorting around him. "Watch out!" Lyra's voice snapped him back to reality. He barely dodged another strike from the creature. Ronan's sword sliced through the air, pushing back the servant's blade. Sparks flew again, but this time, something was different. Kale's sword felt lighter in his hands, the movements more fluid. Was it the power of the silver moonstone? He could feel it, the energy from the moonstone pulsing within him, a silent force urging him to use it. But how could he harness this power? Suddenly, the servant let out a sharp hiss, stumbling back. Its dark armor began to crack, and a strange glow emanated from within. Kale took a step back, his sword at the ready. The creature howled in pain, its body shaking violently. The silver moonstone glowed brighter in Kale's hands, sending waves of energy through him. "Use it," Lyra urged, her eyes wide with fear. But before Kale could react, the creature lunged again, faster than before. Its blade swept toward him with deadly precision. Kale braced himself, but in that instant, something inside him clicked, an instinct awakened. He raised the silver moonstone in his hand, and for a moment, everything slowed down. The world seemed to blur around him, colors blending into one. The cavern grew silent, almost as if time itself had been captured within this moment. In that split second, Kale felt the power of the moonstone surge through him. His hand glowed faintly, and he could feel the energy of dreams within it, the ability to reshape reality. The fear in his heart gave way to something stronger, something ancient. With a single step forward, Kale thrust the moonstone toward the creature. A blinding light erupted from it, engulfing the servant in a wave of energy. The creature let out a final, chilling scream before collapsing to the ground, its body dissolving into a pile of dark dust. Silence returned to the cavern. Kale lowered the moonstone, his hands trembling from the exertion. The fight was over, but something had shifted within him. "Did you see that?" Lyra whispered, her eyes filled with awe. "You used the moonstone's power." Kale nodded, his voice low. "I felt it. I felt connected to something greater. The power of dreams." Ronan stepped forward, eyeing the silver moonstone in Kale's hand. "It's more than just a stone. It's a key to something deeper." Kale looked down at the moonstone, its surface now glowing faintly. "This isn't just about stopping the Dreambinder. It's about control, controlling the dreams within ourselves." Lyra smiled. "And maybe now, we're one step closer to defeating the Dreambinder for good." Kale glanced around the cavern, his mind racing. They had won this battle, but the war had only begun. The silver moonstone pulsed with a quiet energy, a reminder of the power they now held. As they gathered the moonstone and prepared to leave the cavern, Kale felt a strange sense of calm settle within him. The nightmares he had faced seemed small compared to the weight of what lay ahead. But one question lingered in his mind. Would this power come at a cost, or would it guide him toward a future beyond dreams? The journey through the dark labyrinth felt like an endless stretch of time. Kale, Ronan, and Lyra moved silently, each step echoing through the corridors of stone. The once hopeful glint of the silver moonstone was now dulled, its light flickering in Kale's hand like a dying star. The battle with the Dreambinder's servant had been a victory, but it came at a heavy price. Their path ahead was shrouded in darkness, and their only guide was the moonstone. Ronan had been unusually quiet since the battle. His usual confidence was gone, replaced with a quiet, almost unspoken tension. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something to follow them out of the shadows. Kale didn't blame him. The feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. "We need to keep moving," Kale said, his voice breaking the silence. We can't let our guard down. Lyra nodded, her fingers brushing against her own crystal, its glow faint but steady. I feel it too. Like something is following us, something that's not quite real. They had crossed into the heart of the labyrinth days ago, and now, it felt like the very walls themselves were closing in. Each turn they took led them deeper into a place where time no longer made sense. The air felt thick, as if the dreams they sought to escape were alive, wrapping around them. Kale's thoughts raced as he gripped the silver moonstone tighter. The strange connection he felt with it only grew stronger. He could sense the power pulsing within, a force so immense that it left him breathless. Was this the Dreambinder's power? Or was it something more? I don't like this place, Ronan said, breaking Kale's thoughts. Something's off. We've been in the labyrinth for too long, and I don't know, like we're walking in circles. Maybe we are, Kale murmured. But we can't turn back. The Dreambinder is out there, and this is the only way forward. The faint glow of Lyra's crystal flickered again, and Kale's heart skipped a beat. The shadows ahead seemed to shift, stretching and twisting unnaturally. I think we're close, Lyra said, her voice trembling. The Dreambinder's realm is near. I can feel it. Kale took a deep breath. The weight of their mission pressed on him. They had come so far, and yet the real challenge was still ahead. The Dreambinder had to be stopped, but how? Suddenly, a low growl echoed through the tunnel. Kale's instincts flared, and he drew his sword in an instant, the silver moonstone still in his other hand. What was that? Ronan asked, his voice sharp. Before Kale could respond, the ground beneath them trembled. The walls seemed to shift, and a dark figure appeared from the shadows. It moved with incredible speed, its eyes glowing a deep red. Kale barely had time to react as the creature lunged toward him. It was unlike anything they had faced before, an embodiment of nightmares itself. The creature's form twisted, its body a grotesque blend of shadows and smoke. It hissed as it slithered toward them, its claws scraping against the stone floor. Get back! Kale shouted. He raised the silver moonstone, and a burst of energy erupted from it, momentarily halting the creature's advance. The creature screeched in pain, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it reared back, its body flickering in and out of existence. It's not real, Lyra cried. It's just a manifestation of our fears. But it's real enough to kill us, Ronan growled, stepping forward with his sword raised. We can't just stand here. Kale gritted his teeth. He had no time to second-guess himself. The moonstone was their only weapon against the Dreambinder's creations, and he had to use it to its full potential. The creature charged again, but this time Kale was ready. He held the moonstone high, and a surge of energy exploded from it, flooding the tunnel with light. The creature recoiled, its form shuddering as if it couldn't handle the force. You need to focus, Kale muttered under his breath. Use the moonstone's power, control it, and let it break you free from the illusions. Lyra stepped up beside him, her crystal glowing brighter now, its energy flowing in harmony with the moonstone. Ronan, too, seemed to understand. His sword gleamed with an unusual intensity as he struck at the creature, each blow weakening the beast's form. The creature hissed, its form flickering more violently now, as if it were being pulled apart by the force of their combined powers. Kale could feel the moonstone's energy surging within him, its power resonating through his entire body. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the energy guide him, letting it fill the empty spaces within. The force of the moonstone was overwhelming, but Kale knew now that he wasn't just holding it. He was becoming one with it. With a final, overwhelming burst of energy, Kale thrust the silver moonstone forward, and the creature let out a deafening screech before dissipating into the air like smoke. Kale collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. The energy from the moonstone had drained him, and he could feel the weight of their journey settling on him. But the creature was gone. Is it over? Ronan asked, his voice shaky but filled with awe. For now, Kale replied, his voice hoarse. He stood slowly, still feeling the residual power of the moonstone coursing through him. Lyra looked around nervously. But there's something else, something more powerful than this creature. Kale nodded. The Dreambinder is getting closer. The real fight is still ahead. We need to be ready for what's coming. With heavy hearts, the three of them continued forward. The labyrinth seemed to stretch out endlessly before them, but Kale felt a new sense of determination. They had survived one trial, but the real battle for their souls was just beginning. And in the back of his mind, a terrifying question lingered. What would they have to sacrifice to stop the Dreambinder? The air in the labyrinth grew colder with every step they took. Kale's breath was visible in the dim light of the moonstone, a constant reminder of the chilling atmosphere around them. He could feel the weight of their journey pressing down on him. Every corner, every turn in this twisted maze felt like it was designed to break their spirits. But they couldn't afford to stop now, not when they were so close. "I don't like this place," Ronan muttered, his voice low and tense. "We've seen things already that we shouldn't have. Things that shouldn't be real." Kale glanced at him. "I know, but we've made it this far. We can't give up now. The Dreambinder's control over this place is slipping. We're getting closer." Lyra walked ahead, her crystal glowing faintly in her hand. She seemed to be struggling with the weight of the air around them, her steps hesitant. The labyrinth had tested them, but it was clear now that whatever lay ahead was far worse than any creature or illusion they had faced before. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional scrape of Ronan's boots on the stone floor. Kale's grip tightened on the silver moonstone. It was pulsing with energy, responding to the dark forces that surrounded them. But the more it pulsed, the more he felt something deep within it, a gnawing emptiness that threatened to swallow him whole. He shook the thought away. There was no time to dwell on such things. They had a mission to complete. "We need to find the Dreambinder's core," Kale said, his voice filled with determination. "That's the only way we can stop this. Once we destroy it, everything here will collapse. This prison of dreams will be no more." "You think it'll be that easy?" Ronan scoffed. "The Dreambinder has controlled this place for so long. How do we even know what the core looks like? Or where it is?" Kale paused. Ronan had a point. They didn't know much about the Dreambinder's true form or the location of its core, but they couldn't afford to waste time. The longer they stayed in the labyrinth, the stronger the Dreambinder's influence would become. "We'll figure it out," Kale said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "We have the moonstone. It's our only clue. We'll find it." Lyra stopped suddenly, her face pale as she stared down one of the dark corridors ahead. "There's something here," she said quietly. "Something waiting for us." Kale's heart skipped a beat. The air around them had changed. It felt thicker, heavier, like the walls themselves were closing in on them. The sense of dread that had been lurking at the back of his mind surged forward, and for a moment, he was paralyzed with fear. And then they heard it, the sound of something dragging across the stone, the echo of heavy, uneven footsteps that grew louder with each passing second. Kale's pulse quickened. The Dreambinder's influence was growing stronger. They weren't just in its prison now. They were inside its very mind. "It's coming," Kale said, his voice low but urgent. "Get ready." Without warning, a figure stepped out from the shadows, its form cloaked in darkness. It was tall, humanoid, but its face was obscured, hidden behind a mask of swirling smoke. Its eyes glowed with a red, fiery intensity that sent a chill down Kale's spine. This was no ordinary creature. This was something the Dreambinder had sent to stop them. "Stay back," Kale shouted as he held the silver moonstone up in front of him. A burst of energy shot from it, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it extended its hand toward them, and the air grew colder, thicker with the weight of its presence. Lyra raised her crystal, trying to channel its energy, but it flickered weakly in her hand, almost as if it was being drained by the figure's power. "This isn't good," Ronan muttered, his eyes locked on the creature. "We're not ready for this." The figure spoke, its voice a low, eerie whisper that seemed to echo in their minds. "You think you can stop the Dreambinder? You are nothing, just a fleeting dream in a world of nightmares." Kale's grip on the moonstone tightened. "We've made it this far. We're not going to stop now." The figure raised its hand, and the ground beneath them began to shake. Kale's heart raced as the labyrinth seemed to shift, its walls twisting and closing in. The Dreambinder's power was suffocating, and it was clear now that the creature wasn't just a guardian. It was a manifestation of the Dreambinder's will itself. "You cannot win," the figure said again, its voice growing louder. "You are trapped in my world. There is no escape." "We'll see about that," Kale muttered through gritted teeth. He stepped forward, holding the moonstone high. "If we have to fight our way out, then that's what we'll do." Ronan stepped up beside him, his sword drawn and ready. "I've been waiting for this." Lyra, though shaken, stood firm beside them. "We can't let fear control us. The Dreambinder may control the labyrinth, but it doesn't control us." The figure hissed, its form flickering as if it were unsure of its own existence. "You're already lost. The labyrinth is alive. And so am I." With a burst of speed, the creature lunged at them, its hands reaching for Kale's throat. But in that moment, Kale's mind cleared. He focused all his energy into the moonstone, channeling the force that had been pulsing within it. The stone's light grew brighter, a blinding light that filled the entire corridor. The creature screeched in pain, its form distorting as the light struck it. But even as it faltered, the creature's red eyes burned with rage. "This isn't over," it snarled, before vanishing into the shadows with a final, echoing scream. The labyrinth fell silent once more, but Kale knew this wasn't the end. They had survived this trial, but the Dreambinder was still waiting. The core was out there, hidden in the depths of this twisted dreamscape. "We can't stop now," Kale said, breathing heavily. "The core is close. We're getting closer." Ronan nodded, his expression grim. "Let's move. The worst is yet to come." Lyra tightened her grip on her crystal. "We're not alone anymore. The Dreambinder is watching us. But we won't let it win." As they moved forward, Kale couldn't shake the feeling that they were not only racing against time, but also against their own fears. The deeper they went, the more they risked becoming part of the Dreambinder's world. The question now wasn't if they would succeed, it was whether they would still be themselves by the time they reached the core. The walls of the labyrinth had begun to tremble once more, but this time, Kale wasn't sure if it was the shifting corridors or the weight of the impending battle that made the ground beneath his feet feel unstable. The Dreambinder's power was everywhere now, thickening the air, pulling at their every step. They were close, too close. With each step, Kale could feel it. The core, the very source of the Dreambinder's control. It was just ahead, in the heart of the labyrinth. They could end this nightmare. They could end it all. But something felt wrong. Kale glanced at Ronan and Lyra, both walking silently beside him. The once vibrant light from Lyra's crystal was flickering, as though it too was losing its strength, and Ronan's sword was nearly dragging behind him, his exhaustion showing in the slump of his shoulders. The labyrinth was testing them, pushing them to the very edge of their limits. "This isn't the end," Ronan said, his voice steady but strained. "The closer we get, the stronger the Dreambinder's hold will be. We need to be prepared for what's coming." Kale didn't answer. His mind was focused on one thing only, the core. They turned a corner, and the labyrinth suddenly opened up into a vast, circular chamber. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that seemed to shift and writhe as though alive. The air hummed with a deep, resonating energy that made Kale's skin prickle. And in the center of the chamber, hovering just above the ground, was the core. It wasn't a physical object. It wasn't even a solid form. It was an immense, swirling mass of darkness, an ever-moving cloud of shadow and light. Kale could feel its presence pulling at him, a force so powerful it made his mind spin. This was it, the Dreambinder's true heart. "We found it," Kale said, barely able to speak as he took a step toward the core. "This is the Dreambinder's power. Destroy it, and we destroy everything." But even as he spoke, the mass of darkness began to move, expanding outwards like a wave crashing against them. The air grew thicker, pressing in on them from all sides. "No," Lyra gasped, her crystal glowing weakly. "It knows we're here. It's fighting back." The core's shadows twisted and stretched, forming into shapes, nightmarish faces, bodies, all shifting and changing with each breath. Kale's stomach churned as he watched. These were the faces of the lost, the broken dreams that the Dreambinder had trapped in its world. They were watching him, their eyes hollow, pleading for release. The ground beneath them cracked, and the shadows surged forward. Kale lifted the moonstone. "This is it. We end this now." But as he stepped forward, the ground trembled violently. The labyrinth seemed to scream, its walls distorting in a way Cale had never seen before. The entire structure was alive, a living nightmare, and it was fighting to survive. Suddenly, the mass of shadows lunged, its tendrils stretching toward them with terrifying speed. Cale didn't hesitate. He thrust the moonstone forward, unleashing a blast of pure light that tore through the darkness. For a moment, everything stood still. The light from the moonstone clashed with the shadows, creating a blinding explosion that shook the very foundations of the labyrinth. Cale could feel the force of it in his bones, as though the world itself was being torn apart. But even as the light exploded outward, the shadows seemed to laugh. The core's energy surged, and the labyrinth began to pulse with life, threatening to engulf them. "No!" Cale shouted, his voice cracking. "Not yet." The labyrinth, it seemed, had heard his words. With a deafening roar, the core exploded into a blinding burst of energy that sent Cale flying backwards, crashing into the cold, stone floor. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought it was all over. He thought the dream had claimed them. But then, through the haze, he saw the core. It was weakening. Lyra and Ronan were on the ground beside him, struggling to stand. Their eyes were wide, filled with both awe and terror. The core was pulsing, flickering like a dying star. The shadows were vanishing, and the air was no longer thick with darkness. "We did it," Ronan whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. Cale took a shaky breath. "Not yet. We need to finish it." The moonstone, still glowing in his hand, was pulsing stronger than ever. The darkness was fading, but it wasn't gone yet. Cale could feel it, the last remnants of the Dreambinder's power, clinging to life in the core. The battle was not over. Not until the core was destroyed. With all the strength he could muster, Cale lifted the moonstone above his head, and the chamber seemed to respond. The walls trembled again, but this time it wasn't the labyrinth fighting against them. It was the Dreambinder itself, struggling to maintain control. The core shrieked, a sound like 1,000 voices in agony, and Cale poured every ounce of his energy into the moonstone. Light burst from it, filling the chamber with a brilliance so pure, it seemed to burn away the very fabric of the dream world. And then, in one final flash, everything went silent. For a moment, Cale couldn't move. The darkness was gone. The labyrinth had crumbled into nothingness, and in its place, there was only an empty void. Ronan and Lyra slowly stood, their faces pale and exhausted. They looked around, as though expecting something to emerge from the shadows, but the silence was all-consuming. The Dreambinder's presence was gone. It was over. Cale looked at the two of them. "We did it." But as he spoke, a strange emptiness filled the pit of his stomach. It was done. The Dreambinder's prison had fallen, but now they were left with nothing. No dream, no nightmare. Only the stillness of an endless void. "What happens now?" Lyra asked, her voice small, almost lost in the silence. Cale didn't know how to answer. They had defeated the Dreambinder. They had freed the trapped souls, but they had also severed the connection between dreams and reality. The world as they knew it had shifted, and now they were left with the consequences. He turned to them, his heart heavy with the weight of the truth. "Now we start again,"